I'm Stephanie Semler, and I'm going to give a little bit of background information for you in your studies on Aristotle's ethics. To start with, Aristotle's ethics is what we call a virtue theory of ethics. What that means is that a theorist like Aristotle doesn't focus so much on individual actions as he does on the characters of persons. So the question that his theory is attempting to answer is what a virtuous character looks like. What does a good person do? How does one get to be a virtuous character, for example? This is a little bit different than, say, for example, when we talk about Immanuel Kant and the ethics of deontology, or John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism. This approach doesn't look at particular actions and says, well, these are right or these are wrong for these reasons. Rather, Aristotle is going to look at what a well-raised person looks like and then discuss why certain kinds of actions emanate from a virtuous character. Here's just a little background on Aristotle. Of course, I'll also provide you with a few other resources that you can use to just sort of see what Aristotle's overall view was like and the history of him and his work. So start with Aristotle's particular question. Really, it's twofold. What is the highest good? And he's always thinking about highest goods in terms of everything. So, Aristotle did everything under the sun. He was a scientist, he was a biologist, he was a zoologist, a botanist, and when he's thinking about ethics in the context of human beings, he is asking what is the best thing for humans? What is the highest good for human beings? So for him, of course, that's going to be happiness. The word that we use very often for this is eudaimonia. This is the ancient Greek term that Aristotle himself uses. It's important to make a distinction here. I'm going to come back to this, but what he means by happiness is very different than what we usually use the English word to connote. Part of the answer to this question about the highest good is how does one live well? Or sometimes you'll hear it phrased as how does one live and fare well? Aristotle believes that in order to even get started on the route to eudaimonia, to the life well lived, a person needs three excellences. You need excellence of body, excellence of mind, and excellence of soul. Now, the excellences of body and soul, he's not going to go into, excellence of body and mind, he's not going to go into here because excellence of mind is just raw intelligence, right? Raw, rational horsepower. Excellence of body includes things like wealth, health. For the ancient Greeks, that would have included being well-born into, say, an aristocratic or a wealthy family. And all of those things he thinks are just baselines to be able to get to achieving the virtuous life. But they do not in and of themselves consist of the virtuous life. So you've got to have all these things in place, and then you cultivate your excellence of the soul, which is for him where moral virtue resides. So the highest good is that at which everything aims. For us, the highest good is having lived the happy life, having a complete life. This includes everything that we do, all of our intermediate goals. So for example, you're in college, I hope at least somewhat for the love of learning, but like most people who are engaging in higher education these days, you're going to college in order to secure for yourself a better life for you and your family over the course of your lifetime. So you're hoping to get to an avocation that is a lifelong career that will give you the work that will give you the excellence of body, which is wealth, and of course help you cultivate your own plan, right? You want a job that is going to be something that fulfills you. And Aristotle is very well aware of this. So we choose intermediate goals to aim towards this highest end, of course, which is happiness. So I just want to reinforce that Aristotle doesn't mean happiness when he uses the word to say a feeling that you have right now. It's not contentment or joy or ecstasy. Happiness is an achievement. It is the completion of a human life that has been lived well. So this is why, I mean, of course, this predates Aristotle. The Greeks had this concept that no man or woman could be judged happy until he or she is dead. We can't evaluate the life until that person has died. And this also defines what the human function is, right? You might have wanted to know the meaning of life. Aristotle's going to tell you right now that the human function, and also our highest good, is the rational activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. What he means by that is that we live a life, as you're going to see a little bit later, that is full of philosophical contemplation. So you're engaging in the rational activity, but you're also doing so in accordance with moral virtue. So you couldn't just be, say, really, really good at advanced mathematics, but then steal things, right? That's somebody who would fail this human function for Aristotle. And of course, how do we get there? Practice, practice, practice. So not unlike what's required for us to learn how to play a sport, how to play an instrument, as we have here with the great cellist Yo-Yo Ma, how to do anything well. It requires practice. And Aristotle thinks this is absolutely true about moral virtue. So children for him are born morally neutral, and their characters are developed over time through the proper upbringing, so through proper habituation and through a proper education. So those two are not necessarily the same thing. So for example, we ask children to behave virtuously before they're really capable of understanding the rationale behind moral behavior. And then as they grow into maturity, then we start to explain to them, say, for example, why it's a good thing to share your toys with your friends, and why you don't kick or bite or hit other children. They don't understand rationally what the virtue is, but we compel the behavior on them. And Aristotle thinks that that's right, that you can't be a truly moral person if you're not raised properly. So what that means is that for him, a person's moral virtue is the state of his or her soul. Now, don't take soul to be anything too mysterious. For him, there is no immaterial or immortal soul. Aristotle just means to say that the soul is the part of us that puts our material into the shape of human being. So all objects that exist are a composite of matter and form. For us, our form is our natural kind, which if he were alive now, he would understand as the species Homo sapiens. So each individual person's soul is their instantiation of that natural kind. So as you're habituated, your person, the state of your person, is configured in such and such a way, and then that is where your moral virtue resides. It's important for him also to make a distinction, as I'm pointing out right here, between different kinds of wisdom. For Aristotle, moral virtue is a part of what we call practical wisdom. This has to do with the way that we actually behave. It's a little different from other kinds of more abstract knowledge. Say, again, higher mathematics, right? That would be a part of episteme. So habit is the most important element for a person to become habituated to behave virtuously. And the second piece of that is going to be understanding why things are morally, good or bad, praiseworthy or blameworthy. So when we behave virtuously, if we've been habituated correctly, virtuous actions flow from a character that has been habituated properly. So we acquire the skill by repeated practice. You'll see in Nicomachean Ethics where Aristotle says we are, we become what we do. Right? We are a product of our habit. So we begin doing acts of virtue without actually having the habit of virtue. And then at some point you reach this crest. And Aristotle thinks that this happens at about adolescence. And then your character is essentially established. And then from that point forward, the acts that you do flow from the character that you've cultivated. Now, the doctrine of the mean, sometimes called the golden mean, this is Aristotle's model for understanding moral virtue. So it's not as though Aristotle's saying moderation in all things. Right? There are some other traditions that say that, but that's not what Aristotle's saying. What he's saying is, of course, there's always going to be some behaviors that are just clearly bad. So, for example, murder on its face, or theft, those types of things. He thinks that those things are bad, and they're always bad, so it's not as though we should just murder in moderation. But when he talks about the mean, what he wants to say is that the state of our soul that is virtue means that you have the mean state in the term of arithmetical average between two vices. You have a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. So, for example, using this graphic, suppose we were looking at the sphere of feeling, which would be anger, for example, right? So a vicious person is someone who feels too much anger in any given situation. The vice of deficiency would be the person who feels not enough anger, right? We probably think that it's more common to find the vice of excess. So a person who gets angry about very small things, or even in some cases, people who get angry about things that are just unusual to get angry about, that person would suffer from irascibility. That's the vice of excess with respect to anger. The vice of deficiency for Aristotle would be just as much a vice, though. So, for example, if somebody burned your house down and you didn't get very angry about it, Aristotle would say, there's something wrong in River City here. So the virtuous person responds with the right amount of the action or feeling in the right situation. So this is a moving target. It's not always moderation. When somebody does something very, very bad, then that requires a greater deal of anger than it would be if somebody did something that was relatively trivial. Here's a little graphic where you can see some of the virtues that Aristotle himself catalogs. So for example, bravery is the mean state between cowardice and rashness. So somebody who has the vice of cowardice expresses too much fear of death, and of course these are the ancient Greeks, so we're looking at fear of death in war, but it's really the fear of death in the face of danger, and it could be physical or otherwise. And a person who suffers from rashness doesn't have enough fear. And you can see why that would be vicious. Somebody who didn't have enough fear wouldn't be able to make the right practical decisions. Same here for pleasure and pain. This is something that we're all pretty familiar with. What Aristotle means by this is seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. So a person who is temperate seeks the right amount of pleasure in the right circumstances and doesn't avoid pain when it's necessary. So the paradigm case of avoiding pain is exercise. Right? Generally speaking, exercise can have elements that are unpleasant, but the overall results of exercising are good. Right? They're praiseworthy, both in terms of health, and Aristotle would argue also for moral purposes. This would have to do with anything where pleasure and pain are something to be sought or avoided. So this goes with respect to food, it goes with respect to intoxicants. Of course, the Greeks probably would have been the most familiar with wine as far as we know, but any intoxicant would figure on this index for Aristotle. This also goes with respect to sleep, with respect to sex. There's other things that Aristotle couldn't have known about that we can also apply this analysis to, such as, say, video games. It may be reasonable to play video games for relaxation and entertainment, but if you seek that pleasure too much, right, then you'll be an intemperate person as opposed to a temperate person. Again, here the vice of deficiency is less common than the vice of excess. It's going to be a little bit like anger in that respect. Here's some other virtues that Aristotle thinks are important. Generosity, magnificence, those are both with respect to spending money. Think about how public the thing is when it comes to large things. So a person who gives, say, to charity, if they have a large amount of money, this is going to be spending money on large things. The cognate to that in Aristotle's time would have been, how are you spending money with respect to your community? The word for that is oikos, by the way. It was your community before it was a yogurt. Honor in large things, this has to do with lifelong achievements and goals, and even some that may transcend life. A person who gives himself the right amount of honor because that's the honor that they've actually earned. The word we use here in English is magnanimity. A direct transliteration of this virtue, it's megalopsychia, would mean great souledness. I think that's a little better at capturing what Aristotle means. Somebody who is great souled knows how honorable they are, and they accord themselves that appropriate amount of honor. If you accord yourself too much honor, again, this is going to probably be more frequent than somebody who accords themselves too little honor. The Greeks would have found that to be deeply unseemly. Here's a few others. I'll let you take your time with the slide to go over it. Another thing to note is that when Aristotle's talking about virtue, he's talking about practical reason specifically. So what he means by that is that a virtuous person is a person who both reasons about what goals to achieve, reasoning about ends, and can achieve those goals well. That means that they can reason well about the means to achieve those ends. So for example, in being in college, you have made a good choice in reasoning about ends, because securing an education so that you can have a lifelong vocation that will in turn give you an overall well-lived human life, you've made a good goal decision there. But you're also, if you successfully take your courses in college, you're good about reasoning to the means to those ends. Those two are actually kind of separable. You can imagine someone who's very clever, right, achieving one's ends. What are the means that we use to achieving our particular ends? But maybe you choose the wrong goals. So you may be very, very good at, say, bank robbery, but that's not in and of itself a good goal. You didn't reason well about that final goal. I'll go through these slides very briefly. I just want to say a few things about action. Aristotle thinks that action is always this combination of a belief and a desire, and how well we use our reason to enforce our action determines our moral character. So for example, we think we have a belief, right? Things that are fattening should not be eaten because they're unhealthy. Then you see here, I've got this other belief that this cake right here in front of me, this, Cheesecake Factory double deluxe Oreo cheesecake is fattening. The rational conclusion to come to, of course, based on this reasoning here, is that this cake should not be eaten. But anyone who's ever been to Cheesecake Factory can probably tell you that we don't always hold to the straight and narrow when it comes to this kind of reasoning. And Aristotle thinks there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is what he calls krysya, or weakness of will. I think this is a phenomenon that everybody's familiar with. Aristotle has an explanation for why that happens to us. In fact, he thinks that most of our moral failings are a result of this, that most people aren't just bad, terrible, evil people, they're just morally weak. And if you think about it, there's sort of an odd contradiction here. Why is it that we desire something that we know is bad? And why does that come about? Well, Aristotle's answer to that is actually going to have to do with habituation, your upbringing. Here's just a few examples of ordinary cases of akrysya. You don't study, but you go out with your friends before you have a test, or you're trying not to eat chocolate, but if somebody brings chocolate to your desk, you're going to eat it. You might resolve to visit the gym regularly, but then, Netflix exists, so you don't go to the gym. So what happens is that some people are both raised well and they're taught well. Aristotle's going to say there's a very small percentage of the population that is this good, but these people are excellent or virtuous characters. They aim at the good and they desire the good. So their desires and their reasoning are in sync. So they never have any internal conflict when it comes to moral action. Right? They know that it's a good thing to help others in need, and that's in fact what they actually want to do. Aristotle's going to say most of us mere mortals, however, probably fall into the strong character category, which is that at least in some respects, we aim at the good, but sometimes we desire the bad. When we desire the bad, it is because we have been raised improperly. So you may want to think about food as an analogy for this. If you grow up eating fast food or processed foods, you're going to want Cheetos a lot more than you're going to want oatmeal and broccoli, for example. Somebody who is raised on foods that aren't like that are going to have a natural desire that's already cultivated for those natural foods, at least in theory. So a person who is strong does what's morally right, but they have to overcome the conflict. And this is when reason wins out over the desire. So when people do things that are morally pernicious, most of the time, according to Aristotle, it's going to be because they're weak characters. So they aim at the good. They know what the good is. And if you think about it, this is very often a moral admonition that people give to each other. They'll say, well, you did X, Y, Z, and you know better than that, or you were raised better than that. This is precisely what Aristotle means because the person who's a weak character knows what the good is. So the weak character knows that it's a bad thing to steal, or it's a bad thing to kill someone, or it's a bad thing to, sleep with your friend's spouse or something like that. Their decision making is marred by conflict because they have a desire that's contrary to that. The contrary desire is the result of poor habituation, poor upbringing. And then for them, if you're weak, the conflict ends when reason loses and the desire wins, and then these actions are bad, and then you have people who are morally bad. They're not the worst, but they're morally bad. This is weakness of will. This is akrysya. The worst characters are even, as rare as the best characters. These are people who are evil or vicious. Make sure you don't put this in a Christian context, right? Aristotle was living at least 400 years before the birth of Christ, so he wouldn't have had this Judeo-Christian concept. And when he means vicious or evil, he just means somebody who is both habituated improperly, but also taught improperly. So what they believe is worth pursuing is incorrect. So you can imagine someone who is taught to believe that it's a good thing to steal from people, right? That if people are stupid enough to let you take their money from them, then it's your moral right to do so. These people are, in some respects, different from the strong and the weak characters because there's no conflict in their reasoning. But they're incorrect about what the right goals are, and they're also habituated badly. So their actions are bad, and they're morally corrupt people. But as Aristotle's going to say, this is relatively rare. So here's a little chart so you can see the different states of the soul, right? So again, virtue is a state of the soul. A virtuous person knows the good and desires to act accordingly. This person knows what the good is, and they want to do the good. That's their earnest desire. So they reason correctly, they deliberate well, and they know how to achieve the good. These are good people. Strong characters are continent characters. This is a direct transliteration from the Greek. Akrysya means a leaking jar, and krysya means a jar that's holding its water. So the people who are either continent or strong, they're interchangeable, they know what the good is. They've been taught properly, but they haven't been habituated as well, and so they have desires that are in conflict with the truth about what's morally right. So they reason correctly, they don't desire to do the good, but they hold themselves strong, and they still deliberate well. So it's not as good to be a continent person as a virtuous person, but it's certainly better to be a continent person than an incontinent person. This is weakness of will, or akrysya. Just like the continent people, right, the person who is weak of will knows what the good is. Right? They know very well exactly what the moral correct path is, but they desire to act differently due to poor habituation, and then they succumb to the desire. So they don't desire the good, they don't deliberate towards the good. So in general, they're bad people. And again, for Aristotle, this is what most morally bad people are like. Vice, on the other hand, this is through and through. You don't know what the good is, and you're also habituated poorly. No internal conflict, but the actions are bad and the character is bad. So I'm going to end it here. I'm just showing you a couple of other things to think about when it comes to Aristotle. The thing that you want to really focus on is understanding that Aristotle means happiness to be something that's achieved over the course of an entire lifetime. So this is why children can't be happy. For Aristotle. And for him, this is a matter of doctrine. He would say that children may have had an enjoyable time while they were alive, but someone who dies at, say, 20 isn't going to have the full and happy life. They're not going to die happy because they didn't have the chance to create the whole human lifetime. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email or otherwise contact me. And I hope that this little video on Aristotle was helpful. I'll also post the slides in note form so that you can use them while you're listening to the video.